Unit 2.3, Truth Tables. Unit 2.3, Truth Tables. Make sure you put name, date, period, please. All of those count for points. Alright, so you should be watching the video if you were confused and wanted to see it again, or if you were absent and you need to do the practice sheet. If you're just copying it off of somebody else, you're not learning anything. If you're watching the video, you might actually learn what you missed. So don't copy. Use the notes and the video. Alright, truth tables are a convenient way of organizing truth values and statements. So when we have P and Q or P or Q, there's a certain number of possibilities that exist depending on whether or not each statement is true or false. A truth table is just a way to organize that information, right? So we start with negation, which is just the opposite of the statement. So if P, the original statement, is true, then not P is just the opposite. It's just false. And if the original statement P is false, then not P would be true. Negation just means whatever the opposite of the original. So if the original was true, not P is false. If the original was false, not P is true. It's just the opposite. All right, then we have conjunction, which is our and statements. Right? And remember, to be true compound statement, when it's an and statement, they both have to be true. They both have to be true to be true. And if they're not both true, then it's false. The only way to be true on an and statement is if both are true. Then we have our disjunction, which is our or statements. And for our disjunction, in order to be true, one, the other, or both need to be true. At least one has to be true. There has to be a true statement involved in order for the whole thing to be true. So one, the other, or both. Right? So if one, the other, or both is true, then you're true. One or the other, then it's true. One or the other, then it's true. Neither, then it's false. It's much easier to get a true when you're dealing with or, because you only need one or the other to be true. When you're dealing with and, it's much harder to get a true statement because you need both of them to be true. Conjunction is and, disjunction is or. And your and looks like this, right? And your or looks like the V, right? Alright, a couple of tips to help you along the way. Include columns for each statement involved. So if there's two statements, there should be a column for P and Q. There should be two statements, two columns for those statements, right? Include columns for any negations required. So if there is a not P or a not Q or a not R, whatever, you need to include columns for those. If you'll notice on number 2, there is a not P and Q. Okay? That means there is a P statement, so there needs to be a P. There is a Q statement, so you need a Q. And there is a not P, so you need a not P statement. Right? There are two statements, and one of them is a negation. So you should have 3 columns. Lastly, include a column for the compound statement itself. The actual statement needs to go in your last column, not P and Q. Right? So there's 2 statements, one of them has a negation. 2 statements, one of them has a negation. All right, and if you'll notice the pattern up top, when there are two statements, doesn't matter what, if it's P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, doesn't matter. If there are two statements, then there are four possibles. There are four possibilities, right? Both statements can be true. P can be true and Q can be false. P can be false and Q can be true, or both can be false. Right? There are four possibilities, possible outcomes. If there are two statements, there are four possible outcomes. This pattern can be applied to anyone, any truth table that has two statements. Right? So this one has two statements. So the pattern applies. They can both be true. It can be true, false, false, true, or false, false. This is a pattern that repeats. Remember that. It works for number 1. It works for number 3. It works for number 4. It works for number 5. This same pattern repeats because there are two statements. It doesn't matter what the letters are. If there are two statements, this pattern repeats. All right? Now, not P, remember, is the opposite of P. So if P, make sure you're on the right column, P and not P. If P is true, not P is false. It's the opposite, whatever the opposite is. If P is true, not P is false. If P is false, not P is true. If P is false, not P is true. It's just the opposite. This is true, true, false, false. This is false, false, true, true. It's literally the opposite. Alright, and then for your final compound statement, you got to figure out which columns you're using. We're going to use not P and Q, right? So we're going to use not P and Q. And because it's an and statement, in order for it to be true, they both have to be true. True, false, false. False, false, false. True, true, true. False, true, false. In order for it to be true, they both have to be true because it's an and statement. Alright, same thing. This one has two statements, P and R. And then it has two negations, not P and not R. Right? So that's four columns of information. Because you need the original statements and you need the negations because they're in the compound statement. Right? And then you need your final compound statement, not P and not R. Just like we did up here, remember those first two columns repeat because it's two statements. They can both be true, they can be true false, they can be false true, and they can be false false. If you were smart and paying attention, when I told you that the pattern repeats for number 1, number 3, number 4, number 5, you went ahead and filled in this part for all of those numbers. I guess that's how I'll know whether or not you were paying attention. Alright, now, not P is the opposite of P. True, false, 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 true, false, true. And not R is the opposite of R. True, false, false, true, true, false, false, true. Now our final compound statement says we're going to deal with not P and not R. So So we're dealing with these two columns, and it's an AND statement. In order for them to be true, they both have to be true. The only one that has both true is this bottom one. So that means the rest are false. All right, 6, we're making it a little more complicated. Everything we've dealt with so far has had 2 statements. This one has 3 statements, which means we have to adjust the amount of possible outcomes, right? So let's start by putting our statements. There's a P, there's a Q, and there's an R. This one has no negations, so we can ignore that for now. But just like with PEMDAS, you do what's in the parentheses first. Inside the parentheses gets its own column. So Q and R goes in that column, because that's what's in the parentheses. And then the final column gets the whole statement. P or Q and R. We're going to work this one step at a time. Don't panic. All right. Possible outcomes when there are 3 statements. They can all be true. They can all be false. They could be true, true, false, true, false, true, true, false, false. You should end up with 4 that start with true. And then you move on to the false. False, true, true. False, true, false. False, false, true. You should end up with 4 that start with false. This pattern repeats when you have 3 statements, which means it's the same pattern for number 7 and it's the same pattern for number 8. So that means you can go ahead and copy your possible outcomes into 7 and 8. Just make sure you're using the correct statement letters. This one is QPR. This one is PQR. This one has a negation. This one has 2 negations. Just be careful is all I'm saying. But the pattern in the beginning is the same. You have 3 statements. This is the pattern. All right? Now, you start by doing what's inside the parentheses. In the parentheses says Q and R. So we're doing this one and this one, and it's an AND, which means both have to be true. This is both true. This is both true. And that's it. So that means these are true and the rest are false. All right, now we look at P or this column, right? P or what's inside the parentheses. So we're going for P or now remember, if it's an OR statement, at least one needs to be true. So if at least one is true, right? This one has 2 true, true. This one has at least 1 true, true. 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 This one doesn't have any trues, so it's false. False, false, false. False, false, false. Make sure you're using the correct columns, right? It can get overwhelming and they can get mixed up. That's why I'm using different colors, so you can visually see that they're different columns. And if we're going to use P or this column, then we need to focus on this column. Alright, so 8 is as complicated as we're going to get because it has 3 statements and 2 negations. But start simple. Put your statements. We have a P, a Q, and an R. Always start by putting your actual statement letters. Alright? The pattern should already be here because I told you to go ahead and put it in number 7 and number 8. Right? So it should already be true, true, true. What's my pattern? True, true, false. True, false, true. True, true, false. True, false, true. True, false, false. I'm trying to keep it the same so you won't get confused. False, true, true. False, true, false. False, true, true. False, true, false. False, false, true. And then false, false, false. I'm trying to keep it in the same order because if you did what I said and you copied your pattern, then this is what it should look like already. Alright? And then we have 2 negations. We have a not P and we have a not R. We don't need to do a not Q because there is no negation of Q up here. Right? We have all 3 statements and the 2 negations. Let's figure out what our negations are. Not P is the opposite of P. Right? We had 4 truths, 4 false. Now we have 4 false, 4 truths. It's the opposite. It's the flip. Alright? And then we have our not R's. Use the correct column. Don't use Q because we're doing not R, which means we need to look at R. R and not R. We're doing the opposite. All we did was opposite. It was true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false. Now it's false, true, false, true, false, true, false, true. We just made it opposite. Alright, inside the parentheses we have not P or Q. So we're looking at not P or Q. One of them has to be true. Let's circle all of our truths. And then we're looking at this column. At least one of them has to be true to be true. So, true, true, false, false, true, 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 true. Right? These are the only 2 that didn't have a true. So they're the only 2 that ended up being false because we're dealing with an or. Alright, final column is the whole thing, not P or Q, which means we're using this column. And then it says and not R. So we're using not R, which means we're using these 2 columns, and it's an and statement. So let's go back and circle our T's. You don't have to circle the T's, but until you get used to it, it might help you keep it all in order. It might help you see what's what. Alright, and because it's an and statement, they both have to be true to to make it true. They both have to be true to make it true. Everything else is false. Alright, so 1, 3, 5, and 7 are yours. Alright? What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to pause it, and then I'm going to start number 1. And then I'm going to ask you to pause it, and I'm going to start number 3. Just to make sure you're moving in the right direction. Just to make sure you get what you should get. If you don't get 1 and 3 right, go back and figure out what you did wrong before you move on to 5 and 7. Alright, so number 1, go ahead and pause it and try to work it on your own. Alright, so your two statements are PR and your negation is not R. And your compound statement is P or not R. So if you followed the pattern like I told you to, you should have true, 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 false, false, true, false, false. Your not R's should be false, true, false, true. And your P or not R should be true, true, false, true. Did you get what I got? If you didn't get what I got, back it up and figure out what you did wrong. Alright? If you're good, pause it and then come back and see if you got number 3 right. Pause it and try to work number 3. Okay. We have a Q and an R and a not Q, and our compound statement is not Q or R. Same pattern. You should have got true, 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 false, false, true, or false, false. These are your possible outcomes. You're not Q, false, false, true, true. And then we're working with not Q or R. So we're doing these two columns and it's an or. So only one of them has to be true for it to be true. Both of them can be true and it be true, but at least one of them has to be true or it's false. Both of them can be true and it's true. One or the other can be true and it's true, but at least one of them, because it's an or statement. Alright, you do 5 and 7, and when you're finished, get it turned in as quickly as you can so I can get that grade in the grade book. Remember, mastery checks can only be done during class or on makeup day.